The thermometer stopped working 3 days ago, not because it broke, because the mercury itself froze solid at minus 40 degrees Celsius. Somewhere on the outskirts of a forest that Soviet maps didn't name, a German infantryman is pressing his hands against his stomach, trying to remember what warmth feels like. His standard-issue leather boots, designed for temperate European marches, have become coffins for his feet. The wool socks issued in September are now compressed, sweat-soaked, and frozen stiff. Every exhale crystallizes instantly, coating his face in a thin mask of ice. His rifle's bolt won't cycle. The grease has solidified into something resembling concrete. He should be dead. The medical manuals of 1941 would have predicted it. Prolonged exposure at these temperatures, without proper Arctic clothing, without insulated footwear, without heated shelter, leads to incapacitation within hours and death within a day. And yet, this soldier survives. He survives for 3 more weeks. He survives because someone showed him a trick that contradicted everything he thought he knew about staying warm. Meanwhile, 200 meters to his left, another soldier attempts a different improvisation. It seems logical. It feels right. By morning, he will lose both feet. This is the story of how men endured conditions that should have been mathematically unsurvivable, not through heroism, not through superior willpower, through small, strange, counterintuitive adaptations that spread from man to man like whispered secrets. And this is also the story of how identical desperation led others to solutions that killed them just as surely as enemy fire. What separated the living from the dead was not courage, it was information. To understand what happened during the brutal winters of 1941 through 1945, you first have to understand a catastrophic failure that had nothing to do with the battlefield. It happened in offices, in planning rooms, in the confident assumptions of men who had never felt true cold. The German military that invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941 expected victory before winter. Operation Barbarossa was built on the premise that the campaign would conclude in weeks, perhaps months. Winter gear was manufactured in limited quantities. Distribution was delayed. When the cold came early and came hard, millions of soldiers found themselves equipped for autumn in what amounted to an Arctic hellscape. Leather boots cracked. Standard wool offered minimal insulation when wet. Greatcoats designed for Polish winters became useless when temperatures plunged past anything Central Europe had ever recorded. The Americans faced similar disasters during the Ardennes offensive of December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge caught supply lines extended and unprepared. Soldiers in the forest fighting positions received summer-weight combat boots. Overcoats arrived slowly, or not at all. The assumption had been that the war would be mobile, moving fast enough to prevent static exposure. Instead, men found themselves dug into frozen foxholes for weeks. This was not a failure of bravery or training. This was logistical arrogance meeting physical reality. And when the systems failed, individual soldiers were left with a simple choice: adapt or die. We know what they did because they told us. Letters home described specific techniques in careful detail. Diaries recovered from the dead cataloged experiments in staying alive. Medical officers recorded patterns of frostbite, noting which units suffered devastating casualty rates and which, mysteriously, did not. After the war, military historians conducted extensive interviews with survivors, documenting the informal knowledge networks that had emerged under pressure. The physical evidence confirms the testimony. Recovered boots from Eastern Front positions show unusual modifications. Layers of newspaper found pressed between uniform components, straw residue inside footwear, clothing cut and reconfigured in ways that violated regulation but served function. German soldiers were found wearing Soviet Valenki, felt boots stripped from casualties. American GIs wrapped their feet in layers of burlap taken from supply pallets. What the official equipment couldn't provide, desperation invented. Autopsy records from military hospitals tell their own story. Surgeons documented patterns of tissue damage that revealed exactly how men had attempted to survive. Some patterns appeared in clusters. Units that shared knowledge showed similar survival adaptations. Units that remained isolated showed similar fatal errors. The evidence is overwhelming. These were not random acts of improvisation. These were systematic adaptations, developed through painful trial and error, passed between soldiers through informal channels that command structures never documented. The hack that worked was so simple, it seemed almost absurd. And it violated the most basic instincts soldiers had about winter survival. When a soldier feels cold feet, his first impulse is to tighten his boots, pull the laces harder, add more socks, create pressure that feels like protection. This instinct killed thousands of men. The soldiers who survived did the opposite. They loosened their boots. The principle was circulation. At extreme cold, the human body prioritizes core temperature. Blood vessels in the extremities constrict, reducing blood flow to fingers and toes to preserve heat in the organs. Tight footwear accelerated this process catastrophically. Compressed socks reduced the air pockets that provided insulation. Constricted laces acted like tourniquets, limiting the already reduced blood flow.
The effect is immediate.
Within hours, tissue began to die. Survivors learned to keep boots loose enough that they could wiggle their toes freely. They wore a single thin sock rather than multiple thick ones, then filled the remaining space with insulating material. Straw was ideal. Newspaper worked almost as well. Dry grass, cloth scraps, even paper from letters home. Anything that created dead air space without adding compression. This knowledge spread through units in ways that bypassed official channels. A veteran would show a replacement. A survivor from another company would pass through and mention what he'd seen work. The technique wasn't in any manual. Quartermasters didn't distribute instructions. It lived entirely in oral tradition, whispered from man to man in frozen trenches. The result was measurable. Units with higher proportions of veterans showed dramatically lower frostbite rates. Not because veterans were tougher, because veterans knew the trick. The improvisation that killed operated on equally intuitive logic, and that made it even more dangerous. Soldiers suffering from extreme cold in their feet would, when possible, seek out heat sources, fires, heated vehicle engines, warm stoves in captured buildings. The instinct was overwhelming. Frozen feet hurt. Warmth brings relief. The solution seemed obvious. What happened next was physiological disaster. When human tissue freezes, ice crystals form between cells. This causes damage, but the cells themselves often remain potentially viable. If thawing occurs slowly, controlled by gradual rewarming, tissue can sometimes recover. But rapid thawing does something different. It causes a violent expansion of damaged blood vessels. Inflammatory responses cascade. Thawed tissue, now desperately demanding blood flow, meets circulatory systems still constricted by overall cold exposure. Soldiers who thrust frozen feet toward fires experienced immediate, intense pain as tissue thawed. Many described it as the worst sensation of their lives. But the pain was the least of their problems. Within hours, thawed feet swelled grotesquely. Blisters formed, filled with fluid. Tissue that might have survived slow rewarming died from the trauma of rapid temperature change. Gangrene followed. Amputation followed gangrene. Medical officers documented this pattern repeatedly. Men with moderate frostbite who protected their feet from rapid heat exposure often recovered. Men with identical initial injuries who warmed their feet aggressively lost limbs. The treatment that felt most right was precisely the treatment that caused the most harm. The tragic dimension was that this information existed. Military medical guidelines warned against rapid rewarming, but those guidelines rarely reached forward positions. The men making desperate decisions in frozen foxholes had never been told. They followed their instincts, and their instincts betrayed them. The popular memory of World War II winters is built on myths that survivors would not recognize. The first myth is that alcohol helped. Films show soldiers taking swigs of vodka or schnapps to fight the cold. The warm sensation is real. Alcohol dilates blood vessels, creating a temporary flush of heat to the skin. This is precisely why it was dangerous. Dilated blood vessels radiate heat outward, accelerating core temperature loss. The warmth was an illusion, the body spending its reserves faster while feeling temporarily better. Soviet commanders knew this. German medical officers knew this. But the myth persisted because the immediate sensation felt like salvation. The second myth involves movement. Popular narratives emphasize constant activity as the key to warmth. Keep moving, stay active, don't stop. The reality was more complex. Excessive activity caused sweating. Sweat soaked into wool clothing. Wet wool lost most of its insulating properties. Soldiers who worked too hard in cold environments often died faster than those who moderated their exertion. The key was measured activity, enough to maintain circulation without producing perspiration that would later freeze against the skin. Survivors understood this balance intuitively. They moved in deliberate bursts, then rested in sheltered positions, carefully monitoring their own perspiration. This was exhausting cognitive work, constantly adjusting behavior to match conditions. Those who simply pushed harder often paid with their lives. The physical techniques mattered, but they were not sufficient. What separated units with high survival rates from units that collapsed was something harder to measure. It was psychological architecture. Soldiers who maintained rigid schedules, even when those schedules seemed absurd, showed higher cold tolerance. Waking at the same time, eating at the same time, performing equipment checks in the same sequence. The routine provided mental scaffolding that prevented the drift into hopelessness. Men who lost their sense of structure reported feeling colder, faster, making poorer decisions, giving up on self-maintenance behaviors that meant the difference between survival and death. Groups that practiced enforced mutual monitoring showed dramatically better outcomes. Buddies checking each other's faces for the waxy white patches indicating frostbite. Pairs ensuring that the other ate, moved, kept fighting. The soldier who cared only for himself often made small errors of judgment that accumulated into catastrophe. The soldier embedded in a web of mutual obligation received constant small corrections that kept him alive. This was not sentiment. This was thermodynamics expressed through social behavior. Survival in extreme cold requires dozens of small right decisions made continuously over days and weeks. A single brain, exhausted and oxygen deprived, will make mistakes. Multiple brains, watching each other, catch errors before they become fatal. Modern military researchers have tested these historical findings with uncomfortable precision. Cold weather training programs around the world have subjected volunteers to controlled conditions that echo what soldiers faced 8 decades ago. The results confirm what survivors reported. Loose footwear with insulating fill consistently outperforms tight, multi-sock configurations. Gradual rewarming protocols preserve tissue that rapid warming destroys. Moderate, sweat-managed activity maintains core temperature better than either stillness or aggressive exertion. Small group monitoring systems dramatically reduce cold weather injury rates compared to individual survival approaches. The United States Army Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory has documented these principles in technical manuals that would not have surprised a Wehrmacht veteran of 1942. The Swedish military's winter warfare training follows protocols that directly echo informal techniques developed on the Eastern Front. The knowledge that spread through whispered conversations in frozen trenches has become codified doctrine. This matters because it proves something important. The men who survived did not simply get lucky. They were not biologically exceptional. They discovered real principles, tested them through brutal experience, and passed them to others. Their improvisations worked because they aligned with actual physics and physiology, even when they contradicted official guidance and common instinct. There is a temptation to view World War II winter survival as a story of endurance, of men toughing it out through sheer will, of human resilience against impossible odds. This narrative is comforting, but wrong. What actually happened was adaptation. Men who survived did not simply endure conditions. They changed their behavior to match conditions. They rejected instincts that felt right but were wrong. They adopted practices that seemed counterintuitive but were effective. They learned from each other, rapidly, informally, through networks that command structures never organized but also never prevented. The soldiers who died were not weaker. They were not less brave. Many of them fought with extraordinary courage until the moment cold stopped their hearts. What they lacked was information. The right piece of knowledge, passed at the right moment, would have changed everything. This is the uncomfortable reality that connects those frozen forests to the present day. We live in an age of abundant comfort, where the feedback loops between behavior and consequence have been softened almost to invisibility. We can ignore physical reality for long periods because our systems protect us from our errors. The men of 1941 and 1944 had no such buffers. Every decision manifested in flesh within hours. They discovered something that we have largely forgotten, that survival is not a state of being. It is a process of constant, intelligent adjustment to conditions as they actually are, not as we wish them to be. The soldiers who loosened their boots when every instinct screamed to tighten them understood this. The soldiers who kept their feet away from fires while agony demanded warmth understood this. They did not endure the cold. They learned its rules, and having learned them, they obeyed. The next time you feel certainty about what your instincts are telling you, remember them. Remember the men who felt exactly that certainty. Remember that some of them survived because they questioned it, and some of them died because they did not